Hi, folks. My name is Tina Youngju Oh. I am tuning in from Halifax, Nova Scotia, the unceded, the unsurrendered, and the continued future forever territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. I'm speaking today from my positionality as a first generation immigrant settler, as an organizer for the labor union movement, as well as in the movement for migrant justice. We often don't consider labor justice or migrant justice as foundational components to a climate just world, but the utter reality is that these movements for a compassionate, healthy, and dignified planet for all people are inherently intertwined. About 4 months ago, I was in Glasgow, Scotland, attending COP26, the United Nations climate change negotiations. I was there as a trainer, supporting and amplifying the work of Black and Indigenous youth from so-called Canada and their communities. It was my fourth set of negotiations, and it was by far one of the most challenging spaces that I had ever been in. And something that I've noticed, as again, this was my fourth set of negotiations, is that as the climate crisis worsens, so do the state of these negotiations. I think, frankly, what made these negotiations so challenging was the sheer normalcy of business as usual. Greta Thunberg called it a North American greenwashing festival. The largest delegation present at the conference were delegates from oil and gas companies. Essentially, the fossil fuel industry, big oil, had more seats than the United Kingdom government, who was hosting the conference. So what does that tell us? Who's actually hosting this conference? Corporations with the biggest seats at the table are some of the world's wealthiest and have major assets to protect and profit to make. And so a question that I had during these negotiations were, are these negotiations actually about a safe and livable planet? Or is it about maintaining power and wealth for the very few elite, as well as their corporations that have a lot to lose when faced with the prospect of a zero carbon world by 2050? So I found myself in another continent just absolutely horrified at the progression of these United Nations negotiations, which are to this day one of the only tools that the world has that binds the countries together to address the climate crisis and the catastrophes that have come and are yet to come. And year after year, I've seen that these negotiations are losing their efficacy. Even the most modest steps forward get watered down year after year after year. At the same time, in spite of this horrific lack of action from the top, there wasn't a single moment that I felt defeated. I was horrified, I was anxious, and honestly, I think in many ways I was grieving. But to talk about whether or not I was defeated, I can confidently say that I did not feel that at all. And the reason being is because I saw so much incredible resistance, more than ever before, whether they were inside the negotiation space or whether they were outside. And it was ordinary people, working people, young people, Indigenous leaders and elders, young people, environmentalists, and their organizations saying, enough is enough with business as usual. Now, one of the prominent narratives with this recent negotiation has been to push net zero. And we're starting to hear that kind of everywhere. Big corporations like Coca-Cola are committing to net zero. Apple, Silicon Valley giants, they're committing to net zero. And the reality is that net zero doesn't actually mean zero emissions. Net zero means that they're going to continue business as usual, but instead they're going to plant a few trees in X country or buy off or trade carbon credits, and that will ultimately make it to net zero. So again, the resistance that I saw was people resisting this message. People were saying, we don't want your net zero branding scheme. Net zero doesn't actually mean real zero. And people were saying, listen to the science, listen to the ancestral knowledge of the Indigenous peoples who have been stewarding the world's lands. Indigenous resistance is protecting 80% of the global biodiversity of this planet. It is far more effective than any bureaucratic global negotiations that invites fossil fuel industry to the table. So back to when I said that I wasn't defeated, how could I be when so much life-affirming resistance was occurring everywhere around me? It goes without saying that the people leading this incredible resistance were Indigenous and frontline people from all over the world. The people who are the most impacted by climate change were sharing stories, knowledge, and speaking power to what it means to interrupt and intervene in these inadequate spaces. To kind of cap it off there, the biggest lesson I've learned in organizing for the labor movement, the climate movement, and the migrant justice movement is shifting my thinking to one of scarcity to one of abundance. Capitalism makes us think that we're inadequate. It makes us think that we're living in perpetual scarcity. It manufactures scarcity thinking, that there's never enough money, that there's not enough room in this country to allow migrants, that there's not enough time to act on the climate crisis. But the reality is that we live in a world of abundance. Yes, we're living in a time of crisis, but there is ultimately more than enough space for everyone at the table. There is abundance of work being done, even as I speak, of people in every corner of the earth doing their part. I saw that in Glasgow, and as Justin said, he's seeing the solutions come from the community. It's hard to feel defeated if we acknowledge the gratitude of abundance. We have enough time, not a lot of time to take action, but we do have time and we need to do something about it, and we have to believe, and we ultimately have to act because no one else will. Thank you.